Hey class, this is Dr. Cantu. This is a review session for exam 2. I wanted to go over that review guide with you to help you prepare for the exam that's coming up. In this exam, we're going to cover chapter 4, 5, and 6, as you see on the study guide. So let's go ahead and go through them. There's going to be 25 multiple choice on chapter 4. You're going to have 20 arguments. Most of them will be fallacies. There's going to be a few non-fallacies in there, but you have to, identify which fallacy the particular passage is exemplifying. In chapter 6, we're going to have some applications. So you'll have, let's see, 4 translations, and those I believe are going to be 2 points each. And then there's going to be 3 arguments that you'll have to test for validity using the truth table method. Those are going to be 4 points each. So let's go ahead and start with chapter 4. And the first thing that you have to, or the first concept we have here is principles for assessing claims. So now there's a couple principles that chapter 4 starts off with. The first one states that if some conflicts with something that we have one other claim or other claims that we have good reason to believe, then we have grounds for doubting the claim that conflicts with the other claims that we have good reason to believe. So that's the first principle. And so you could think of just a simple statement like you're in your room in your house, say, right, and then somebody texts you, saying, oh, your house is on fire. Well, actually, I have very good reason to believe that it's not on fire because I'm in my house right now. So you have good reason for rejecting the claim that your house is on fire. That's the first principle. The second one has to do with background information. So the second principle says, that if something conflicts with our background information, then we have good grounds for doubting it. And our background information, to take us to the second point here, pertains to the knowledge that we have, which we have good reason to believe, which we've gotten from reliable knowledge bases, like the information that we've gotten from our higher institutions, regarding what happened in history, right? How the world works physically. So, information that we get from physicists, quantum mechanics, astronomers, social science is also another, good base of knowledge, there's degrees of probability, obviously, within the field itself, but some of the claims that we have there are going to be, well-grounded and highly probable. Background information also includes our experience, common sense. So, what we know about the sciences and, what we know from our experience. Okay, so now what do we do when claims conflict with background information? Well, the principle actually tells us, right, you ought to doubt, that which conflicts with background information. Doesn't mean that it's false. It just means, that we don't have good reason for accepting, something that conflicts with our background information. So, so we can go ahead and doubt it. And then, if it turns out to be true, it sort of needs, it might require a revision, in our background beliefs. And, that might be of a very radical sort, like when in Newtonian physics, there used to be the belief that light traveled in a straight line. Okay, well, it turns out that it doesn't travel in a straight line. It can actually curve in relativistic physics. So when it was proved, that light curves, in space when it travels, that required, a radical revision in our scientific view of the world. Let's see. Okay, so it looks like these two are the same. So we have That's just a duplicate there. Okay, so what to do with claims neither worthy of outright rejection or deserving of complete acceptance. So this is sort of the gray area that text talks about, where something is, you know, um, you don't have good reason for rejecting it, right? Good grounds for doubting it, but neither do you have good reasons for accepting it. So in those cases, what you want to do is you want to proportion your belief to the evidence. Say about religion and ethics. He said that ethics should be based on sympathy, not reason. So took a position, on this issue. And now, if one were to sort of say, "Oh, that must be true because Einstein said it," then that is a fallacy of appeal to unqualified authority because Einstein doesn't have, the expertise within that particular subject area, ethics, whereas he does have, expertise in the subject area of physics. Okay, so moving on, personal experience and claims.